Lacey Whitmore vanished on the night of her high school prom. 5 years later, the man who had led every search, lit every candle, and cried on every news broadcast, her own father, Thomas Whitmore, was arrested for her murder. What began as a heartbreaking mystery unraveled into one of the most chilling betrayals a family could endure. On the night of June 3, 2018, Lacey Whitmore disappeared. She was 17, full of promise, and brimming with the kind of energy that made people believe she was going places. That night was supposed to be one of celebration, a milestone for every high school senior. Prom. Photos were taken in front of the Whitmore family's small white house on a sunny suburban street in Willow Creek, Indiana. Lacey wore a blue sequined gown that shimmered in the sunlight. Her hair had been done professionally, her nails perfectly painted. Her date, Jason, arrived with a corsage and a borrowed tux, nervously adjusting his tie. Lacey's parents, Thomas and Rachel, stood outside smiling, capturing every moment on their phones. There was no sign of what was about to happen. No warning, no uneasiness. Just a proud family seeing their daughter off to what should have been one of the happiest nights of her life. Neighbors waved as the couple drove off. That was the last time Lacey's parents ever saw her. The next morning, everything fell apart. Lacey hadn't come home. Her room, untouched since she left, still held the faint scent of perfume and hairspray. Her bed remained made, the covers undisturbed. Her phone was off. No one had heard from her. Thomas initially believed she might have stayed at a friend's house. Rachel, growing more frantic by the hour, began calling everyone. Friends, classmates, school officials. No one had seen Lacey after the dance ended. Her date, Jason, said she told him she felt a little off midway through the night. She insisted she was fine, didn't want to ruin the evening, and asked him to let her leave early. She claimed she'd call for a ride or get an Uber. Jason never saw her again. By noon, the police were involved. Lacey's purse was found discarded near a gas station roughly 5 miles from the high school. Her shoes were missing. The surveillance footage from the station didn't show her. There were no witnesses who remembered seeing a young girl in a prom dress walking alone. Her car was still in the school parking lot. Her phone, either turned off or dead, couldn't be tracked. That afternoon, local news stations picked up the story. Willow Creek teen missing after prom flashed across screens. Volunteers poured in to help search. Forest paths were combed, parking lots scanned. Nearby lakes and riverbeds inspected. Helicopters buzzed overhead for days. Dogs trained to sniff out human scent were brought in from neighboring counties. Thomas Whitmore, with red-rimmed eyes and a calm but tired voice, made public pleas for any information. He described his daughter as responsible, cheerful, never one to sneak off or disappear. Rachel, meanwhile, stayed mostly indoors. Friends said she was barely functioning, unable to eat or sleep, often standing in Lacey's bedroom staring at her untouched belongings. Rumors spread fast. Some believed Lacey had run away, though no one could say why. Others whispered about a possible stalker. There were theories about drugs, about her being lured away, even kidnapped. Police questioned teachers, classmates, former boyfriends, and anyone who had contact with her in the weeks leading up to prom. No one could offer anything useful. Lacey hadn't mentioned any concerns, hadn't acted strangely, and hadn't left any notes or clues. Her social media stopped abruptly that night, right after a selfie from the dance. She posted it smiling, twinkling lights behind her, captioned simply, "Best night ever." But that night ended in silence. As days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Police classified her as a missing person, possibly endangered. The Whitmore home turned into a quiet, mourning space. Thomas kept appearing in interviews, keeping Lacey's story alive. He organized search efforts and community events in her name. Each anniversary, he released messages online begging for answers. The family even offered a reward. Rachel eventually stopped appearing publicly, her grief deepening into isolation. She was rarely seen outside, and neighbors said she looked like a ghost of her former self. Despite countless tips, none led anywhere. There was no evidence, no body, no suspect. It was as if Lacey had vanished into thin air. For 5 years, her case remained unsolved. Willow Creek, a town unaccustomed to tragedy, was left with a gaping hole and a question that refused to fade. What really happened to Lacey Whitmore on prom night? The days after Lacey Whitmore's disappearance turned into weeks, and then months, and still there were no answers. The town of Willow Creek had never experienced anything like it. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where kids played until dark, and where neighbors greeted each other by name. The disappearance of a bright, beloved high school senior during one of the most important nights of her life shook the town's foundation. Everything became centered around finding Lacey. Flyers with her smiling face, framed by carefully curled brown hair and blue sequins, were posted on telephone poles, taped to gas pumps, and pinned to bulletin boards in grocery stores. Volunteers handed them out at festivals, ball games, and even nearby towns. A Facebook group titled, "Bring Lacey Home," grew to thousands of members. People offered prayers, made donations, and joined in organized searches of wooded areas, parks, abandoned buildings, and riverbanks. Even strangers with no connection to the family showed up to help. Thomas Whitmore quickly became the face of the movement. He was seen everywhere, doing everything possible to keep Lacey's case in the public eye. He spoke at town halls, gave interviews to local TV stations, and stood at the center of every search group with a map in hand. He seemed determined, composed, always thanking volunteers with a firm handshake or a quiet word of gratitude. People admired him for his strength and composure during an unimaginable time. Rachel Whitmore, in contrast, had nearly disappeared from view. Friends said she barely left the house. When she did, she looked thin, pale, and fragile. Grief had taken its toll. She stopped going to work, pulled away from social events, and even declined to speak at the yearly candlelight vigils held in her daughter's honor. Those who knew her said she never stopped hoping, but also never stopped crying. As time went on, tips and leads continued to trickle in, but none led to anything concrete. There were occasional spikes in interest, when someone claimed to have seen a girl who looked like Lacey in a different state, or when a tipster insisted they overheard something suspicious. Each time, police followed through, and each time, the trail went cold. Surveillance footage from the school was reviewed hundreds of times. Traffic cameras were scoured. Forensics teams revisited every item of clothing, every scrap of evidence. Still, there was nothing to explain how a girl could vanish in a public place, leaving no trace. The case eventually lost its headline status. New stories took over the news cycle. People still remembered Lacey, but fewer showed up to the searches. The posters began to fade and peel off the walls. Online discussions slowed, but Thomas never gave up. He launched a small foundation in Lacey's name to raise awareness about missing children. He went to conferences, spoke to other families, and published open letters online every year on her birthday. In each one, he described her smile, her laugh, the last words she said before leaving for prom. His words were steady, heartfelt, and filled with hope. Yet behind the scenes, the investigators had grown frustrated. They couldn't rule out foul play, but without evidence, they were stuck. Lacey's phone was never recovered. Her purse yielded no fingerprints besides her own. No one saw her get into a car. No security footage placed her anywhere after she left the dance. It was like a puzzle with no edges and missing pieces in the middle. Rumors in town continued to circulate. Some believed she had run away. Others suspected an abduction. A few whispered that someone close to her had to be involved. After all, crimes like these didn't happen without warning. But there were no signs of a struggle, no motive, no solid suspects. Thomas was never considered one. He had an alibi, a clean record, and a mountain of public support. Lacey's room remained exactly as she left it. Her posters, her books, her prom dress hanging on the back of the door, like it was waiting for her to come back. Rachel sometimes sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, unable to speak. She said she could still smell her daughter's perfume. By the 5th year, Lacey's case had faded into the category of unsolved mysteries. Willow Creek moved forward, but the wound never truly healed. For many, Lacey's name was still spoken in quiet tones, her photo still taped to refrigerators or tucked inside wallets. The town tried to forget, but couldn't. The girl in the blue dress was still missing, and no one knew why. The search had left the community shattered, united only by the single question that refused to disappear: where was Lacey Whitmore? 5 years after Lacey Whitmore disappeared, a chance discovery changed everything. It was late August 2023 when a group of county workers began clearing land on the edge of Willow Creek's eastern forest to expand a walking trail. The area had once been searched, but years of rain, wind, and overgrowth had reshaped the landscape. As workers dug deeper into a patch of earth behind a fallen tree, a shovel struck something hard. At first, they assumed it was a rock or debris, but what they uncovered instead sent shockwaves through the quiet town. Buried just a few feet below the surface were human remains. The workers halted construction immediately and called the authorities. Forensics arrived within hours, cordoning off the area with yellow tape as news helicopters circled overhead. The forest, once a place where families walked their dogs and children played, became the center of a grim investigation. Dental records confirmed the truth. The town had feared for years the remains belonged to Lacey Whitmore. Her skeleton was found wrapped in a deteriorated plastic sheet, tucked beneath layers of compact soil, rocks, and branches. An autopsy revealed the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. It was a killing blow. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. Forensic analysts concluded that she likely died within hours of leaving prom. The shock was immediate. People who had helped search that same forest years ago were stunned to learn they'd been so close. The location, just under a mile from the Whitmore home, raised difficult questions. How had no one found her? How had she been hidden so well in an area that had been searched so thoroughly? News of the discovery reignited national interest in the case. Media trucks once again lined Willow Creek's streets. Residents rehashed every detail, every rumor, every suspicious detail they had once ignored. And slowly, the investigation turned inward. Detectives began re-interviewing those close to Lacey. Her classmates, old friends, teachers, and neighbors were all revisited. But this time, their questions weren't as broad. They were looking for something specific, something they had missed. And what they found changed everything. Attention slowly turned back to Lacey's father, Thomas Whitmore. On the surface, he had done everything a grieving parent should. He led searches, gave interviews, and never stopped advocating for his daughter. But the more closely investigators looked at his behavior, the more questions emerged. In his original statement, Thomas claimed that on the night of Lacey's disappearance, he had gone to bed early and stayed home the entire night. He told officers that he received a text from Lacey around midnight, saying she was fine and would be home soon. But new phone records obtained during the reopened investigation revealed something troubling. Thomas's phone had pinged off a tower near the gas station where Lacey's purse was found. At 20:18 a.m., that location was nowhere near his home, and he never mentioned leaving the house. Worse, surveillance footage from a nearby business showed a dark, colored SUV driving past at the same time. It matched the make and model of the vehicle Thomas owned in 2018, a vehicle he sold just weeks after Lacey disappeared. Investigators tracked down the SUV. Its new owner had no idea of its past. The vehicle was examined, and traces of blood were found in the trunk's interior lining. Forensic testing confirmed what police feared. The blood belonged to Lacey. This revelation cracked the case wide open. Investigators dug deeper into Thomas's background and discovered more disturbing information. Hidden among deleted emails and encrypted folders were messages between Thomas and a woman who had once worked at Lacey's high school. The messages revealed a secret relationship, one that had apparently started months before Lacey went missing. In one email, dated just a week before prom, the woman warned Thomas that someone might find out. She never mentioned Lacey by name, but the implication was chilling. Suddenly, the image of the grieving father began to fall apart. The town struggled to process what they were hearing. The man who had stood at the front of every vigil, who had spoken to crowds with tears in his eyes, was now a suspect in his own daughter's murder. For many, it felt like betrayal on a level they couldn't comprehend. The search for Lacey had always been built on trust. Trust in her family, her father, and the belief that no parent could harm their child. Now, that trust was broken. The arrest of Thomas Whitmore sent shockwaves through every corner of Willow Creek. People struggled to reconcile the man they had seen on television, pleading for help, thanking volunteers standing beneath missing person posters, with the man now being led into a police station in handcuffs. For 5 years, he had played the role of a heartbroken father. Now, investigators were piecing together a much darker truth. Detectives began to reconstruct the days leading up to Lacey's disappearance. It became clear that tension had been brewing inside the Whitmore home. While Rachel described their marriage as distant but functional, she admitted that in the months before prom, she had started to notice strange behavior in her husband. He had become more withdrawn, started taking long walks alone at night, and would often leave the house under vague excuses. She chalked it up to stress, perhaps grief over their daughter's upcoming graduation and looming departure for college. but now with new evidence. Everything she thought she knew about those nights began to unravel. Investigators discovered that Thomas's secret relationship with the school employee had been going on for over a year. The woman, whose name was not publicly released due to safety concerns, was a married teacher's aide who worked closely with several students, including Lacey. Through recovered emails and texts, investigators found out that Lacey had become aware of the affair. In a private conversation with a close friend, one that only came to light after the case was reopened, Lacey had mentioned seeing something she wasn't supposed to see, involving her father and a woman from school. She hadn't said more, but the implication was clear. Police believe that Lacey confronted her father about the affair in the days leading up to prom. She may have threatened to tell her mother or expose the relationship to others at school. Thomas, already feeling pressure and fear over the possible consequences, may have snapped. The exact sequence of events remained unclear, but prosecutors argued that on prom night, Thomas saw an opportunity to silence his daughter and protect his secret. It was likely not a premeditated murder. Forensic analysis suggested that the blow to Lacey's head was delivered with an object found in the Whitmore garage, a heavy tire iron, long since cleaned and placed back. She may have come home early from prom, or perhaps Thomas picked her up after she left the dance. The purse found near the gas station was likely part of the plan to stage an abduction, leading police away from the home. Her body, carefully wrapped and buried in a remote section of the nearby forest, had been hidden so well that even trained search teams had missed it. Further investigation revealed that Thomas had sold his SUV just 3 weeks after her disappearance. He told friends and neighbors it was too painful to drive the car she had ridden in. But in reality, the vehicle contained key evidence. Traces of Lacey's blood in the trunk, along with human hair and fibers matching her prom dress, painted a damning picture. Prosecutors said it was where he placed her body before transporting her to the burial site. Rachel, blindsided by the arrest, cooperated fully with authorities. She submitted to interviews, provided old records, and gave permission for a second search of the house. When asked if she had ever suspected her husband, she said no, not until the evidence started mounting. She described moments that, in hindsight, seemed suspicious. The way he always insisted on being the one to talk to the press, how he discouraged her from looking at Lacey's phone records, and how he always seemed too composed in public. In court documents, prosecutors painted Thomas as a man who allowed fear and shame to lead him down an irreversible path. Rather than risk exposure, he had chosen silence and committed the unthinkable. The community that once rallied behind him now watched in disbelief as each new piece of evidence came to light. The trial was scheduled within months of his arrest, and anticipation grew. Local news covered every development. Former supporters distanced themselves. The Lacey Whitmore Foundation quietly dissolved. The house where the family had once posed for prom photos stood silent, the grass uncut, the windows dark. Willow Creek, once united in grief and hope, was now divided by betrayal and shock. The father they had trusted was not who he claimed to be. And for many, the horror was not just in the crime itself, but in the years of deception that followed. Thomas Whitmore's trial began in February 2024, drawing national attention and bringing the quiet town of Willow Creek back into the spotlight. Crowds lined up outside the courthouse on the first day, many of them the same people who had once walked wooded trails with Thomas in search of his daughter. Now they stood in disbelief, waiting to see what evidence would be revealed. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, former neighbors, friends of the family, and even former classmates of Lacey. Everyone wanted to understand how the man they had trusted could have lived a lie for 5 years. Prosecutors presented their case methodically, laying out a timeline that showed Thomas's descent from a seemingly ordinary father into a man capable of murder. They opened with the forensic evidence. Lacey's blood found in the lining of the SUV trunk, her hair-matching fibers collected from a tarp discovered near her burial site, and the location of the burial itself, less than a mile from the family home. Experts testified that the area had been skillfully chosen and concealed, indicating someone who knew the terrain well and had the means to dig late at night without being noticed. But it wasn't just physical evidence. The digital trail told its own story. Deleted emails between Thomas and the school employee he had been romantically involved with revealed not just an affair, but a growing sense of paranoia. He had begun expressing fear that someone close would ruin everything. Though her name was never mentioned directly, the context pointed clearly to Lacey. The woman herself, who had since moved out of state and refused all public comment, was subpoenaed to testify. She admitted to the affair, broke down on the stand, and said she had ended all contact with Thomas shortly after Lacey's disappearance. She claimed she never suspected he was involved, but was now haunted by what she might have overlooked. Perhaps the most devastating moment of the trial came when Rachel Whitmore took the stand. Pale, quiet, and visibly shaken, she spoke with a trembling voice as she described the years of uncertainty, the pain of not knowing, and the moment she learned her husband had been arrested. She said she felt like her entire life had been rewritten overnight. When asked if she believed Thomas had killed their daughter, she looked down and answered, "Yes." Her words silenced the room. The defense tried to raise doubts. They suggested the blood in the car could have come from an earlier injury. They questioned the accuracy of the phone tower pings. They even hinted at the possibility of someone else being involved. Someone who used Thomas's car or knew about his affair. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury seemed unmoved. After 3 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the verdict was guilty of second-degree murder and obstruction of justice. Thomas Whitmore was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He showed no emotion as the sentence was delivered. No tears, no final statements, just a blank stare ahead. The town of Willow Creek was left to pick up the pieces. Many residents felt betrayed not only by Thomas, but by their own belief in his innocence. For years, they had rallied around him, convinced that he was a grieving father doing everything he could to find his daughter. They had donated to his search funds, stood beside him at vigils, and trusted his every word. Now they realized they had been standing beside the man responsible all along. Lacey's memory, however, endured. A memorial garden was created in the park where she used to jog, planted with her favorite flowers, lilies and forget-me-nots. Her name was etched into a granite bench, where people could sit and remember the girl who should have had a future. The high school she attended began offering scholarships in her name to students pursuing degrees in journalism, the field she once dreamed of entering. Rachel eventually moved away from Willow Creek, unable to bear the memories. She gave one final interview before leaving, saying she hoped people would remember her daughter not for how she died, but for how she lived. Kind, passionate, and full of promise. In the end, justice had come, but it brought little comfort. The truth had been buried as deeply as Lacey herself, hidden beneath layers of lies and silence. And when it finally surfaced, it left a scar on everyone who had once believed that monsters only came from outside the home.